Okay, ready to go? This week's Oscars are just 5 days away. So, in honor of Sunday's event, we will be talking about one of the founding members of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, aka the Academy, as in, I'd like to thank the Academy. This woman was one of the most famous and highest paid actresses in Hollywood, the Julia Roberts or Jennifer Lawrence of her time. She was also a producer, a screenwriter, and one of the founders of the United Artists Film Studio. She was known as the Girl with the Golden Curls, Our Mary, and America's Sweetheart. But she was born right here in Toronto. This episode of Muddy York is about Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford was a superstar in the 1910s and 20s, but that was almost a century ago. I would guess that most people today have never even heard of her. Gray, did you know who she was before we started working on this episode?
I took some film studies in university, and I do remember the name, but I guess I didn't pay attention that well because it's news to me.
Well, I'm sure there's a lesson in there about the fleeting nature of fame. In any case, before she became a superstar, Mary Pickford was born on April 8, 1892, as Gladys Louise Smith at 211 University Avenue. Now, today, University is a busy downtown street, lined with skyscrapers and hospitals. But at the end of the 19th century, it was a whole lot humbler. Mary's home was a simple 2-story brick row house with only 6 rooms. This was very typical for working-class homes in Victorian Toronto. She would later recall the one real joy of her childhood was riding her bike down University Avenue, which only had houses on her side of the street.
I wouldn't suggest letting your children ride their bike down university today, though.
Well, actually, Mary's home was built on the same land where the Hospital for Sick Children stands today. This is somewhat appropriate because Mary was a sick child and suffered at various times from tuberculosis, pneumonia, and what turn-of-the-century doctors called nervous disorders. In fact, she visited the children's hospital so often that the head of the hospital and his wife actually offered to adopt her. Her mother was Irish Catholic, while her father was English Methodist. Their children weren't originally baptized to avoid offending either family. However, her maternal grandmother had Mary discreetly baptized by a Catholic priest when she was 4 and sick with diphtheria. Later, she would also be baptized as a Protestant after her father died and her mother wanted to honor his Methodist heritage.
I mean, I guess it's good to cover all the bases.
No harm in being extra cautious. Mary's father was said to have the same golden brown hair as his daughter's famous curls. Mary felt a particular affinity for him and remembered him taking her to look at the tulips at Queen's Park or to go tobogganing at Hyde Park. Unfortunately, he had a problem with alcohol and would eventually leave the family. But Mary always remembered him as a fun-loving man whom she adored. In 1898, he was working as a purser on one of the paddle steamers that ran from Toronto to Lewiston, New York, when he suffered a fatal head injury, dying at the young age of 30. Mary's mother, Charlotte, now had to look after Mary, her 2 younger siblings, and her disabled mother, all on her own. Mary would later write, "I can close my eyes and still hear that scream of mothers at the moment father passed on." By now, the family had gone through their savings and were forced to move. Eventually, they wound up at 9 Ord Street, just off University, south of College. Charlotte had trouble making enough money to provide for everyone, and Mary would sometimes have to rely on the generosity of neighbors in order to get something to eat. Mary was the oldest, and she took responsibility for helping to raise her siblings. Her sister would later say, "Mary has always been little mother to the whole family. She was constantly looking after our needs. I always used to think that she imagined Jack and I were just big dolls. Some people have noted that Mary's actions are similar to those of other children of alcoholics, who try to fill the gap left by an absent parent by assuming their responsibilities and becoming perfectionists. Mary grew close to her mother during this time. Later in life, Charlotte Pickford would become Mary's unofficial agent and business manager. One of Mary's producers told her, "I don't have to diet. Every time I talk over a new contract with you and your mother, I lose 10 pounds.
Not to rush the story along, but when did Gladys Smith become Mary Pickford?
Well, the story that Mary told was that Charlotte had rented out one of the rooms in her house to a Mr. Murphy and his family. However, people have pointed out that, considering the family's dire financial situation, it's unlikely that Charlotte would have owned their home, so Mr. Murphy was probably just a boarder in the same rooming house. In any case, he turned out to be the stage manager for the Cummings Stock Company, performing at the Princess Theater on King Street. He needed children to participate in a play called The Silver King, and asked Charlotte if her children would appear in the production, but she was very hesitant. In those days, theaters were seen as rowdy and disreputable, and this wasn't entirely wrong. Victorian audiences were a lot more raucous than audiences today. Mary would describe her mother's fears about her children being around the likes of actresses who smoked. But her family needed the money, and Mr. Murphy assured her that his theater group was respectable, so Charlotte agreed to let her children join the cast. On January 8, 1900, Gladys Louise Smith made her acting debut alongside her sister. She had exactly one line. The Silver King ran for 8 performances, and Mary and her sister were paid $8 each for their performances.
For the rest of the year, Mary and her sister would continue to perform in various shows around Toronto. In November, the Valentine Stock Company was planning their own production of The Silver King, and Charlotte sent Mary to audition for the same part. After all, she had already played the role, so the audition should be easy. However, on her own initiative, Mary declared that she wanted to try for a larger role, which she promptly won. By the time the show closed, Mary had become the official child actor for the Valentine Stock Company. In September of 1901, the touring production of a show called In Convict Stripes needed a new child actress for their production. Mary had played the role in Toronto, and they wanted her to join them. However, Charlotte insisted that if they wanted Mary, they would have to take the entire family. Amazingly, they agreed. They found jobs for everyone, and the entire family would be paid $20 a week. At this point, the Smiths had become a full-time stage family. For the next 6 years, they would travel with touring productions, and Little Gladys, as she was called, would learn scripts on the train while traveling to perform across Canada and the United States. Mary claimed to have learned to read from billboards along the side of the tracks. She also said that she hated the color cerise because it was the color of train seats. You should remember that these productions were run on a very tight budget, and life on the road could be very hard. Her family had to pay all of their own traveling expenses, and on trains, they often had to sleep in their seats because they couldn't afford sleeping berths. Mary once told a friend that she had been the most miserable child in the world, and when her sisters were asked about their childhood, she replied, "We had none." Mary's big break would come in 1907, when a well-known producer named David Belasco cast her in his production of The Warrens of Virginia. She won this role by effectively stalking Belasco, sending him letters or photographs, and repeatedly showing up at his office until he agreed to cast her in his new production. Belasco convinced her to adopt a new stage name. When he asked her about her middle name, she lied and said it was Marie. Pickford came from her maternal grandfather, Jack Pickford Hennessy, and so little Gladys Louise Smith became Mary Pickford. As her fame grew, her mother and siblings would also adopt the Pickford name.
When did Mary become the film star that she's known as today?
Well, the first moving pictures were recorded in 1878, but movies didn't become common until the 1910s. In 1909, Mary traveled to the offices of the Biograph Film Company where she would meet pioneering filmmaker D.W. Griffith. Mary traveled to the office of the Biograph Film Company where she would meet pioneering filmmaker D.W. Griffith. She loved telling the story that when Griffith offered her the standard $5 a day, she pulled herself up to her full 5 feet and said, "I'm a Belasco actress and I must have 10." Mary would appear in 51 movies in 1909 alone. As she said, "I played a scuba woman and secretaries and women of all nationalities. I decided that if I could get into as many pictures as possible, I'd become known and there would be a demand for my work." She was right.
So, did she stay in Hollywood from that point on?
Actually, she was still in New York because early American films were not made in Hollywood. All the best known theaters were all on the East Coast, so many of the early film pioneers assumed that would be the center of movie production. D.W. Griffith began the migration to California when he took a select group there to film over the winter. Mary was part of that group, and she would actually be part of the very first movie ever made in Hollywood, a 17-minute western called In Old California. For the next few years, Mary would perform on both stage and screen, but after 1913, she would work exclusively in film, joining the studio that would become Paramount Pictures. The following year, a pair of movies called Hearts Adrift and Tess of the Storm Country would make her a superstar. Her appeal was described as luminous tenderness and a steel band of gutter ferocity. A review of Tess in the Storm Country said, "It was only Mary Pickford who can create through the silent medium just that particular kind of sentiment. Ineffably sweet, joyously young, and sometimes, if one may put it so, almost unbearably heartbreaking in its tender photos, which has become identified with her name." The films publicly described Mary as America's sweetheart, and this became her most famous nickname. During World War I, she became a symbol of Americana, selling war bonds, kissing the American flag for photographers, and even auctioning off one of her famous curls, all in the name of the war effort. Many people have pointed out the irony that America's sweetheart was Canadian. Over the next decade, Mary would become a legend of the early silver screen. In 1919, she co-founded United Artists along D.W. Griffith, Charlie Chaplin, and Douglas Fairbanks. This studio would produce hundreds of films, including Rocky and Casino Royale, before Amazon dissolved it about 4 years ago. For the record, the last movie released by this distinguished film studio was one of my personal favorites, actually, Hot Tub Time Machine 2. Mary was one of several Canadians among the early pioneers of Hollywood, alongside with Jack Warner, Louis B. Mayer, and Norma Shearer. She was also one of the only 3 women among the 36 founders of the Academy, which would award her the second ever Oscar for Best Actress in her performance in 1929's Coquette. This award was controversial because most people agree that Coquette is not a great film. Initially, Oscar winners were chosen by special committees, and Mary had used her influences to actively lobby the judges. See, lobbying the judges happened even back then. The controversy over this award led the Academy to change Oscar voting to the one-member, one-vote system that is still used today. Still controversial, but hey.
Well, this was also the first example of somebody getting an acting Oscar as a Lifetime Achievement Award. They weren't really giving it to her for Coquette, they were giving it to her for her career. So some things never change. But what about her later years?
Well, many silent movie stars did not make the transition when sound was added to film. Mary was one of them. She said that adding sound to movies was like putting lipstick on the Venus de Milo, and the real artistry was in the visual of a silent performance. After her retirement, she developed a drinking problem, just like her father, and became something of a recluse. She is said to have been one of the inspirations for Norma Desmond, the faded silent film star in Sunset Boulevard. Only a few years before her death, she granted a rare look inside her life when she accepted an honorary Oscar, noting her importance to the film industry. She died on May 29th, 1979. Mary Pickford always remembered where she came from. Like all Canadians, Mary was born a British subject because Canadian citizenship didn't exist until 1947. But during the 70s, Pickford decided to acquire Canadian citizenship because she wanted to die as a Canadian. Good on her. Her request was approved and she officially became a Canadian citizen.
That must have been important to her.
From what we read, it really was. When her childhood home was torn down in 1943, Mary had 20 of its bricks shipped to her in California. We could see her true thoughts about Toronto from an interview with CBC in 1959. She talked about her time in Toronto and how it was changing beyond recognition from her days as little Gladys Smith. She remarked on how she dreamed at least once a month of Toronto and Queen's Park, and how she would always be a real Torontonian.
Well, that concludes our episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay tuned to our next episode. We'll catch you then.